Welcome back to day 3, using student ecologies for effective instruction in general and special education, or instruction and assessment for multilinguals in tier 3 and special education, with Dr. Julie Esparza Brown. I'm Kirsten DeRoche, an educational consultant from the Patton East office. I'll be one of your facilitators this afternoon. I'm joined by my 2 colleagues, Heather Paremba and David Vasquez. If you need closed captioning, please click on the button on your Zoom taskbar and the transcript should be visible. My colleagues and I will be monitoring the chat for any questions or technological needs. Please feel free to reach out to any one of us if you need any help. Wanted to just note, oops, I lost my notes here. Just note that at Patton, we're committed to the belief that families and caregivers are an integral component of effective school systems and promote parity among schools, families, and communities. At this point, we ask that if you are sharing a computer with a colleague, please ensure that your Zoom profile name reflects who is listening to the session this afternoon. This is going to help us ensure that we can correctly attribute your attendance to you for any credit that you wish to receive. Just a few quick reminders about the Zoom controls. You should have a Zoom taskbar with a mute and a start/stop video button that is available. Please ensure, if you do not mean to be speaking, that your mute button is turned off. And you can see the participants by clicking participant on your Zoom taskbar, and you can see the chat by clicking the chat button. That way you will get access to any links that are added or ways that you can respond to any questions throughout the session. I don't think we're going to be doing this. Let me move this a little bit quicker here. Sorry. And at this point, I think I'm going to stop share here. And at this point, I just wanted to hope that you will all join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Esparza Brown. Dr. Julie Esparza Brown is a professor of special education at Portland State University. Prior to joining PSU, she worked in public schools as a special, bilingual, and bilingual special education teacher and a school psychologist. Her teaching, research, and publications focus on the intersection of language, dis/ability, race, and culture, and she is a passionate advocate for equity in education. Additionally, she regularly consults and presents nationally and internationally on these issues. Dr. Brown recently completed a 4-year term as an elected school board member for the largest school district in Oregon. Currently, she is a principal investigator of a personnel preparation grant through the Office of English Language Acquisition to prepare diverse special educators and to improve literacy outcomes for multilingual students. Dr. Brown recently completed work as a principal investigator on a model demonstration grant funded through the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Programs that investigated culturally and linguistically responsive literacy interventions within an MTSS framework for English learner students at risk for or with disabilities, Project LEA. She has been principal investigator on 4 federal personnel preparation grants. Her current co-authored book, Supporting English Learners in the Classroom, Distinguishing Language Acquisition from Learning Disabilities, is available through Teachers College Press. Dr. Esparza Brown, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Pennsylvania again virtually, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Greetings, everybody. It's for me, I can say good morning, and I know it's afternoon in your time zone. I'm in kind of sunny San Diego. Happy to be here with you, and I will. So I think we're going to begin, Kirsten, with sharing a poll just to get a sense of who's in the audience and what roles you play in schools. So here it is. And if you would be so kind.
So this poll, if you go to the link that I think is Yep, Heather just added to the chat, or you can text Kirsten DeRoche 285 to the phone number 22333. Then you can enter here what your role is. If you are other, please enter that in the chat so that we know.
Great, is it?
All right.
In addition to what's coming up in the poll, I'm seeing lots of D, so speech language pathologists. I'm seeing more of that in the chat as well.
Okay, ELD specialist, subspecial ed, school psych. Glad to have administrators here. Instructional coach. Okay. School psych. Great.
Okay, so I can stop share, right?
Great. Yes.
Okie doke. And now you can share Dr. Esparza Brown if you would like.
Okay. Great. A nice mix of folks, and hopefully that'll lead to some great conversations virtually. All right. So this is session 3 of a 3-part series. And okay. Sometimes just getting situated for, here's the button that moves us ahead. Where is it? There it is. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I want to acknowledge that I have a team at Portland State University of brilliant scholars, Dr. Amanda Sanford and Dr. Sheldon Lohman, who work with me on these projects. So acknowledge that they are a part of this work. So let's start out with thinking about multilingual learners. So while educators often speak about multilingual learners as a group, the reality is MLs vary on many factors. Knowledge of student level factors help to align instructional practices to meet ML students' unique needs. So to answer the question of whether academic challenges are rooted in second language acquisition differences or a true disability, all students must have access to high quality core instruction matched to their specific backgrounds. So we will examine the typologies of this heterogeneous group and discuss specific instructional factors to consider. Then we'll review the MTSS tiers and how data collected across the tiers by a collaborative team guide appropriate referral decisions. And then finally, we'll discuss special education eligibility and programming and IEPs. So kick back and here we go. So as I said, these are what we will be looking at today. And okay. Why am I having trouble with the buttons today? Here's a quote from our book. When English learner students encounter, so I will probably switch between using EL and ML, and I prefer to use the multilingual learners or MLs because it continues to emphasize that asset of being bilingual and multilingual. So when EL students encounter academic challenges, too often educators' first response is to refer them for a special education evaluation. Instead, it's critical to look at instructional factors, particularly regarding the alignment or fit of instructional strategies to students' level of instructional language proficiency, their culture, and their previous education and life experiences. So again, going back to those typologies and understanding that our students are a very diverse group, and knowing the factors of their specific background center is going to help us guide us to the most appropriate and effective instruction. And that's the key. So here's just a slide of your wonderful equity practices in Pennsylvania. And I love that your state is really walking the talk to sponsor webinars such as these. Okay, so who are multilingual learners? So again, I have them kind of broken up into what I call typologies of multilingual students for the purpose, again, of looking to see their backgrounds, language experiences, educational experiences, and then how that's going to guide instruction. Okay, so we need to understand the diversity or the contextual factors within our groups. So different profiles based on students' educational and contextual backgrounds will determine their learning focus. So as a teacher, you have access to school records to help you learn the backgrounds of students. But I will also say that school records aren't enough. So often they come with very little information in them. So who do we need to turn to in order to really find out more about the student? Of course, that's the family. And in our busy school days, so often we have limited time to reach out to families, but particularly for students that may be newcomers, newcomers to the country, newcomers to your school, it will be incredibly helpful as you plan their instruction to gain information from the families. But regardless of typology, all students' progress need to be continuously monitored. So who are multilingual learners? So here's a graphic that just names a few of the different types of multilingual learners. So we have here English learner students who have exited the programs, but we continue to need to monitor those students for 2 years after they exit an ELD program. And those students, because of the language experiences that they have across 2 or more languages, may not ever really, in terms of language, catch up to a native English speaker in terms of there may still be gaps all along, so we need to take that into consideration. And there's a new term in the literature that we call ever ELs. I think that has really helped us become aware that even when students have exited a program, that we need to watch their progress and make sure that they're not falling behind because of some gaps in their language. There are English learner or multilingual students that are currently enrolled in an ESL, ELD, or Title III program and receiving language services. There are multilingual learners that we call long-term that have been in programs for 7 years or more in an ELD program. Those students really need to be looked at carefully and a question answered. The first question, what has the quality of their ELD program been for them not to have made expected annual progress for them to exit ESL ELD programs in about 5 years, which is typical. Oftentimes, those students that are long-term ELs may have a disability that we haven't identified. So red flag that. Then there are multilingual learners that are newcomers to the United States. Perhaps they've been here less than 6 months and they have very specific instructional needs. Students with interrupted formal education. So those are students that come to our country oftentimes through refugee camps that have not had access to formal education. Sometimes there are students who come from rural regions of their country, also with limited access. And then there's English learners and multilingual learners in special education. So they're, as you can see, a very broad group. So it's hard when we say multilingual learners, what does that really mean? So we're going to go through a few of these a little more closely. US born students, English learners who are US citizens, and they account for the largest percentage of multilingual learners in our schools. But unfortunately, this is the group that also shows the poorest academic outcomes. So we have to question why our own US born citizens are struggling in our schools. And as you can see, foreign born, born outside of the United States, transnational. So particularly in the border states like California, Arizona, Texas, we have students who may live across the border in Mexico and who come to the United States daily for their education. So we call those transnational multilingual learners. Newcomers, as we went over earlier. Okay, and digging down a little deeper, we also have students that come to us highly schooled. So those are multilingual learners who have been in the US maybe 1 or 2 years, but they've attained grade level or higher level education in their home language and in their home country. These students often will have a fairly easy time acquiring English and staying on track with grade level content once we really help them with the language, because they have that foundation to build on. Then we have newcomer multilingual learners that have limited English, but if we can build on the skills that they come with, again, they're not going to have too much of a hard transition to an English education. And when possible, we want to continue to offer those students dual language programs when available. Then we have students with interrupted or limited formal education, and sometimes we use the acronym SLIFE. And these are students, as I said a little earlier, who have had limited or no access to school in their home country. So therefore, they have limited literacy in their native language and little or no English proficiency. So there's a lot of needs there. Long-term multilingual English learners, the acronym, they're known as LTELs, who remain classified for 5 years or longer in ELD programs that are stalled in one English proficiency level for multiple years. And these students generally have received all of their education in the US. So again, the question is, what do our instructional programs look like that have allowed them to stall and not make progress in their acquisition of English? Oops. Reclassified English learners, those again, as I said earlier, sometimes known as ever English learners, have met the state's linguistic and academic criteria to be reclassified as fluent English proficient students. We monitor them after they exit the program, but we still want to keep a close eye to make sure that any struggles that they have may not be due to some language gaps. And then ELs in special education. Well, we are very careful not to over-identify English learners as needing special education. It is true that there will be multilingual English learners who do have disabilities and who have the right to access those programs. And a bulk of the presentation today will be talking about how we make those determinations and difference from disability to ensure that we are providing the right services to the right students. Okay, now given that information, your turn to think. So here's a case, Kenshi. So Kenshi entered 2nd grade 6 years ago from Chuk and is now in 8th grade. On the English proficiency test in 2nd grade, he scored at the beginning level. In 5th grade, he scored at the intermediate level and has continued to score at that level since then. So this illustrates what typology and what instructional approaches might help him. So hopefully you were listening during the typology, because I think, yes, here we go. And you can click on this link. Can we put it in the chat? Let's see. Is the link in the chat? Hello?
Yes, it is.
Perfect, thank you. And if you would please go to the chat and what typology is Kinchi? And then think about what instructional approaches might he need? Give you a few moments.
Okay.
I think that was a different one, Kirsten. I think that was the one I sent you.
Oh, it was. You're right. I'm wrong. I don't have that. I don't have the link to that. I'm sorry.
Okay,
To this one. I don't,
it's on the slide. Do you see the slide?
yeah, I was, could somebody, I'm sorry, I have too many screens open right now.
I'm trying to
Trying
get
to
to it
do
too. I'm
too
not sure.
many things at once.
No worries.
Let me pull the link. I've got it now.
back to it.
I
Okay,
will put that into the chat.
great. Thank you for bearing with us. You can click if you have the PDF open. Perfect. Thank you for that tip, Elizabeth. I don't, okay.
So I just attempted the, what I just put in, the current Kenji
Yeah,
poll for Google form, and it opened for me. So I'm hoping, excellent. Great. Thank you, Lavinda, for letting us know. Thanks, Bran.
great. Give you a few moments. And I see we have 10 responses. Kirsten, what do you see on the screen? Can you see my the Google form?
Yeah, I see 47 responses. I'm seeing the answers.
Great.
Yep.
Great, great. This is fun. Keep them coming. I see we have 182 participants. About a third of you have responded. I'll give you a couple minutes. Okay, let's take about another 2 minutes and call it good. Thank you for those of you that are responding. Love it. Okay, well, let's take a look now. There'll be a couple more of these. If you didn't respond to this one, you'll have more opportunity. So Kenshi. So he entered second grade 6 years ago. So the question is, he's now in 8th grade, and he's continued to score at the intermediate level of English proficiency since 5th grade. So when we go back to think about those profiles that I was talking about, this is a student whose proficiency has stalled for several years. So meaning he has been receiving ELD services for at least 6 years. So he would likely be best classified as a long-term English learner, and I think that's in the pink. He's also, let's see, the red, foreign-born multilingual learner. That's true. So he really is both of those. Instructionally speaking, it may be more important to really look at that long-term English learner and ask the question of why has his English proficiency stalled out? Wondering how that's impacting his academic acquisition also. So let's look to see what kind of responses you had in terms of instructional approaches. Yes, a student like this certainly would need extended time in probably assignments and assessment, academic language focus, absolutely. So I think in our last presentation, I shared a comment that was made by a principal that I work with, and it's very true. Language can't be learned in 30 minutes a day, meaning while we really rely on ELD specialists during their instructional time of English proficiency to help our students progress, they have to have language support throughout every content area and throughout their day, because only focusing on language during those 30 minutes a day is not going to really help them become proficient. So we all have to be skilled at helping students bridge those language gaps and helping them to learn vocabulary and language structures. So on multi-tiered support system, problem-solving protocol, absolutely. A student like this, we need to dig down deeper to look at, what's the root of the problem. Sometimes students may not actually be receiving the language support services that they qualify for maybe they're overlooked. More English learner instruction, absolutely. So in interventions, right? So through an MTSS a protocol, we'd look to see, want to really look to see what support he needs in academically and align that, couple that with language instruction. Pre-teach vocabulary, absolutely. So visuals, great. So you all have some great ideas here. Perfect. And I'll get back to my PowerPoint. It's not always easy to toggle between all of these screens, so thank you for bearing with me. Okay. All right, so that was Kenshi. Next, we have Carl. So Carl entered the 4th grade in a US school. Prior to that, he lived and attended school consistently in Mexico City. Okay, not a lot of information, but from that, what is his typology and what kind of approaches might help him? And so once again, here's a link. Kirsten, are you able to copy that into the chat?
I just put it in the chat, make sure everybody can access it.
Great. And I will take us there. And here's Carl. Put on those thinking caps again, and let's see what you think. Who is Carl? Foreign born, US born, transnational, newcomer, highly schooled newcomer, SLIFE, LTEL, reclassified ML, ML and SPED. Great, we have 22 responses already. Keep them coming. Let's see if we can get 90 responses this time. Yeah, we're at 80. Great. Yeah, we're at 90. Okay. Great. So Carl, the key here is that he attended school consistently in his home country. So that's who we call a highly schooled newcomer, but he's new to the country, but he attended school consistently. Therefore, what do we know about the kinds of skills that he should be bringing with him? He probably is at least on grade level and is fully proficient in Spanish, whereas many of our US multilingual students that toggle between two languages often don't develop proficiency across the two language early on. So Carl, having been immersed in his native language, likely has high levels of proficiency that we can build on. And so what are some of the instructional approaches that might work for Carl? Pull out to address probably English, ELD instruction, dual language support. Yeah, it'd be great if it could be in a dual language program, but often students are not allowed to enter a dual language program except in kindergarten and first grade. Therefore, we're developing both languages over time. Vocabulary instruction, explicit instruction. Yes, great. And again, the key is remembering that he comes with a firm foundation, likely in both language, his native language, and in academic areas, and it's easy to build on those foundations. Great. Okay. Now going back to okay. And I think we have one more. So this is cute little Mirabel, who recently arrived in the US and enrolled in 4th grade. What happened there? In her home country of Uruguay, she rarely attended school due to living in a very remote region of the country. Consequently, Mirabel does not have grade level knowledge in Spanish, much less English. At her new school, there is one other student in a similar situation, Alonso from Colombia. While he had some formal education in his native country, due to a lack of resources, instruction was inadequate. So these two students, they are an illustration of what typology and what kind of instruction might they need. And once again, here's the link. I'm going to click on it and hope that you get the link in the chat. And it looks like it is there. Thank you. All right. So far, 10 responses. Great. Can we get 100 responses this time? Let's go for it. Keep them coming. Good, we're at 60. We're getting there. Another couple minutes. We are at 86. Awesome. Let's shoot for 100. $90, 10 more to go. Oh no, somebody said they got kicked out of the link.
I think we got that fixed.
Oh, okay, great. Another minute or so and well, we got to 95, very close, and some in the chat. So thank you for those of you that responded in the chat. Here we go. So I think that is a light blue, and the majority of you said Slife. Yes, this is a student with interrupted formal education. It's also true that they're a newcomer. They're not a transnational student. So transnational students are those that cross the border every day of the week or during the school week to come to school in the United States. Let's see. Right. So they are definitely a student, both of these students with interrupted formal education. Instructional approaches. Oh, this is hard to tell. The biggest one being small group instruction. Absolutely. And I see a lot of access educational levels in primary language. Yes, it's absolutely great to build on their primary language and then teach for transfer into English. Absolutely. They're going to need a lot of language support, obviously, but what about their grade level skills? Will they be on grade level if they've had limited access to formal instruction? No. So they will need lots of small group support, likely, beginning literacy support, if possible, starting again in their home language and breaking the code if they haven't in that home language, and then learning to transfer that into English. But they will need lots of support because they most likely will not be on grade level due to that lack of instruction. Great, thank you. Thank you for your engagement. This is really awesome. Okay, so let's take a little pause there. And these buttons make it hard to work. Get the screen to do what I want it to do. So let's move into a refresher of culturally and linguistically aligned multi-tiered systems of support. So here you see the typical triangle.
Dr. Brown, could you reshare your PowerPoint?
Yes, I'm looking for that button. Why do they not come up when you need them?
I don't know.
I know, huh? Technology can be so frustrating. Why? Okay, let me do this. And get back to Zoom. Okay, here we go. Now, you see it?
Yep, we're good. Mhm.
Okay, it's like magic. Now you see it, now you don't. Okay, so here, the typical triangle. And then here's one that's culturally and linguistically responsive or aligned. So you've seen this over the last two presentations, but as a reminder, you still see the three levels in the inter portion of this triangle, with green being representative of meeting the needs of about 80% of our students and each student group, meaning that we disaggregate the data to make sure that we are not leaving a particular group of students behind at the bottom of the class achievement. And then the yellow represents 15 to 20% of students, again, in each group that might need additional support to help them meet core benchmarks. And then at the top, the smallest triangle being red to meet the needs of 5 students with intensive support needs. Now, the vertical lines that you see in the colored portion of the triangle represents that students will be proficient in the instructional language across these different levels. Some have beginning levels of proficiency in English or in a second language if it's a dual language program. And some may be fluent and everywhere in between. And that strategies appropriate to teach students at those proficiency levels need to be embedded throughout and across all of the tiers. So they don't just receive ESL instruction in tier 1, which they do, it's part of core curriculum, but those kinds of supports need to be included throughout the interventions. And that's the key. And then the purple or the blue frame around the triangle represents the PLUS framework that we went over more in depth in our first 2 presentations that represent an overlay to instruction and interventions that help us to provide the supports through language, through building background knowledge, to making cultural connections, to providing systematic and explicit instruction, as well as teaching for transfer and strategic use of native language. So those are an overlay at all instructional tiers. Okay, now I'm going to next go through the tiers and what kinds of support that we need to ensure that happens across these MTS tiers before we start thinking about a referral. So today, again, we're really focusing on what brings us to making those decisions to refer a student for a special education evaluation. When is it appropriate? What do we need to make sure that is in place in our system to help us make those decisions most appropriately? So the first bullet, we do want to use true peer group comparisons in order to gauge adequate instructional progress. So in our last 2 presentations, I know that I defined true peer group, and I'll define it here again, as students that are most like a target student in terms of their typology of multilingual learner, their native language group, their current level of English proficiency, their instructional program, like whether they've been in a 2-way immersion program, an English only program. So we're looking for characteristics to help make the best comparisons that we can before determining, who might be falling behind. So what we don't want to do is compare a 2nd grade English learner like Media Bell, who's a newcomer, to a 2nd grade peer. That would not be a fair comparison to gauge instructional progress because they have 2 very different backgrounds and instructional gaps and needs, and as well as strengths and cultural backgrounds that they bring. So we want to make comparisons as close to, to like students or groups of students as possible. It may not always be possible to create a true peer group if you have students that come from a language group that is that they may be the only family in your system that speaks that language. But then again, we're going to look at other characteristics, try to make the comparisons as closely as possible to be fair in terms of gauging progress. We want to review students' records to note any health concerns, attendance, school experiences, and progress. But again, if you have a student like Mirabel who had limited access to education, likely she's not going to come with robust school records. And it would be important then early on to have a conversation with parents to gather as much information as you can. You want to connect with families to learn about the milestones, any injuries that they've had, literacy in the home, the culture, language use. So again, that's really important early on. And examine the fit of core instruction. Use valid and reliable screening and progress monitoring assessments. And I think we've covered that in the previous two sessions, that while many in the field question the validity of using curriculum-based measures that we use for screening and progress monitoring with multilingual learners, there is a fair amount of literature and research that does show that they are good predictors of later reading ability. So they do seem to be valid and reliable for this population as well. We're not using screening tools or progress monitoring tools to label students or to for eligibility for special education. They are merely going to give us a roadmap as to where students are at in skills that we know predict later academic abilities, and to provide instruction beginning with where they're at. And then we want to make sure to monitor grade level benchmarks and compare their progress to true peers and to grade level benchmarks. Okay, so that all needs to be in place in Tier 1. When that's in place and we see students that are outliers from their true peer groups, they then may need to be placed into an intervention program through Tier 2. So before we get to referrals in Tiers 2 and 3, we want to ensure that, particularly for multilingual learners, right, that the interventions are aligned with core, but also culturally and linguistically aligned with students' needs. So in general, we match the language of interventions to the language of instruction. So this is really relevant to those two-way or dual language immersion programs. If the student is receiving maybe 80% of their instruction in grade 1 in Spanish or Vietnamese, then the interventions should also match the language of instruction. We provide intervention cycles for adequate time. So sometimes I hear, well, interventions we put in place 6 to 8 weeks. Well, the literature doesn't support that 6 to 8 weeks is an adequate length of time to really see change or progress. So we want to make sure that the duration could be 8 to 20 weeks. And daily 30 to 120 minutes, depending on if you're in Tiers 2 or 3. Now, let's talk a little bit about the duration, 8 to 20 weeks. We do want to check in, progress monitor how they're coming along in terms of achievement in their intervention. And if it isn't working, say after 8 weeks, we do want to switch it up. And try something different, and then continue for more weeks. So that 20 weeks doesn't mean that if a program isn't working, we leave it in place all those 20 weeks. We do want to do those check-ins to see if we need to make some tweaks or some adjustments, or maybe they need more language support. But definitely we want to give it time, give them time with higher intensity interventions to see if they make progress. We adjust the group size when indicated, and we continue to monitor progress as compared to grade level benchmarks and true peers. And after working our way through tiers 2 and perhaps into tier 3, we refer for a special education evaluation when progress is insufficient, but we want to give that time. And I know that sometimes teachers get frustrated with how much time it takes to get a referral. So there's a reason why we want to make sure that we're providing the right support for an appropriate length of time and at the appropriate intensity before we start going down the referral for special education. Yet there are students that are multilingual learners that truly need to be referred. Okay, and I see a few comments here in the chat, and let's see if I can address some of them. What if there are no true peer group comparisons? So the closest that we might be able to have as a true peer group comparison are other English learners. So again, the key is we cannot compare a multilingual or English learner student with another age level student who's an English only student, because they've had the opportunity to fully develop their language in the instructional language. So that's not a true, it's not a fair comparison. So as looking again at those characteristics and trying to match another student that is in their situation as closely as possible. So it's not an exact science, but again, it really helps to cement the concept that a grade level peer is not the appropriate comparison to gauge progress. Now, grade level peer that's meeting benchmarks is a comparison in terms of that's our goal for all students, is we need to help them close those gaps. Okay, I am glad that this is a useful slide. Recommended group size for intervention. Generally in tier 2, we usually say 5 to 7 or 3 to 5. And 3 to 5. And in tier 3, 1 to 3. So we really, sometimes it's individual. Okay, great. All right. So I keep putting questions in the chat, and I will try to remember to stop and check those out as we go along. All right. So a lot of the next portion is really going to be talking special education issues. So after we've ensured that we have provided adequate and appropriate interventions, core instruction and interventions across the tiers, there will be times when a special education referral is warranted. And so once again, as a reminder that children with disabilities are a heterogeneous group with unique educational needs. So they may have learning challenges, they may have physical impairments or visual impairments, communication needs, emotional behavioral challenges, locomotor challenges, sensory challenges. They are as varied as any group of students. So there are laws in our country that protect students with disabilities, and the current law is called IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this act was reauthorized in 2004, which was a very long time ago. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But before the current law, the first public law was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act of 1975, or known as PL 94-142. Before that time, the educational needs of millions of children with disabilities was not fully met because the children did not receive appropriate educational services. They were generally excluded entirely from public school systems and from being educated alongside their peers. And often undiagnosed difficult disabilities prevented children from having a successful educational experience because often, difficulties were thought to be, choice by children, right? Their misbehavior, without really identifying roots of problems and then knowing how to remediate. So all of this really equated to lack of resources and services within public schools, so that families were forced to find private placements if they had the resources. So this was an incredibly important law, and it didn't occur till 1975. Okay, so PL 94-142 gave grants to the states, then gave money to states to educate children with disabilities. And since that time, this act has been amended several times. And the last amendment was in 2004. For years, the field has been saying, oh, it's time for reauthorization of IDEA. But actually what I hear from the field that's occurring right now is our current administration may be somewhat worried about opening this law up for reauthorization, because in our current political climate, there may be a push in which to weaken some of the protections in this law. So right now, it's been a hard-fought battle to have a law that provides protections to children and their families, children with disabilities and their families. And so we want to continue to maintain the level of protection that we have currently. So in the future, we will look to having this law amended, and each time we really look to add entitlements and strengthen rights and services to children. Now, the major purposes of our current law, IDEA, is to ensure that all children with disabilities have available to them a free, appropriate public education that emphasizes special education and related services. And related services might be speech and language services, occupational therapy, adaptive PE, and such, that are designed to meet their unique needs and prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. The rights of children with disabilities and their parents are protected. To help the states, localities, educational service agencies, and federal agencies provide for the education of all children with disabilities, and to assess the effective efforts to educate children with disabilities. So that's the purpose of the law. Again, free, appropriate public education, even when children need more intensive services, that is at public expense. Okay, now, over time, the Office of Civil Rights, over the last several years, provides these guidance letters to the field that are called Dear Colleague letters. And I'm going to be referring to some of these letters throughout the presentation that really help guide in terms of how to really interpret the law and how they interpret IDEA. So in a letter dated September 12th, 2016, the Office for Civil Rights stated that the use of evidence-based intervention strategies to provide help and support within the general education setting to students who need such support must not serve as a substitute or a precondition for an evaluation for students believed to need such an evaluation. So therefore, a student does not legally need to progress through MTSS tiers for a referral. So examining how a student responds to intervention will primarily relate to disabilities. No, I'm sorry, I made an error here. Will primarily relate to disabilities of specific language learning disability and specific language impairment. So what does this all mean? So what this means is that we can't, if we think that a student has a disability, we have evidence to believe that, that we actually, a system does not need to go through all the tiers of support for a referral to take place. best practices, particularly when we're looking at communication disorders or specific learning disability, when instruction is involved and how they progress on instruction and development of academic skills in language, we do want to give them time to progress through the tiers before making a referral. Now, we'll talk about this a little later as well. What does enough time mean? So while we want to see how children respond to instruction, we don't need years of interventions prior to a referral. And that often happens for multilingual learners for some factors that we'll be getting to in a moment. So we don't need to provide interventions for years before making referrals. And for some students, we may not need to progress through MTSS tiers if there's evidence that they have a disability. Okay, so we're going to look at this through a couple of cases relating to this issue. Okay, and I can't see my chat box, so hopefully if there are burning questions that somebody could call them out, okay?
Yep, we'll let you know.
Great, thanks. Okay, so let's look at case one. So in the first month of a school year, a teacher suspects that a Spanish-speaking multilingual student with very limited proficiency in English has a learning disability. The teacher would ordinarily refer the student for an evaluation if the student is suspected of having a learning disability and needing special education services due to the disability. But the teacher delays referring the EL student for an evaluation. However, because he believes it would not be possible to appropriately evaluate the student until the student achieves intermediate proficiency in English. So the parent of the EL student files a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights, alleging discrimination on the basis of national origin. So the student is not getting a referral because of their lack of English proficiency. So, is this complaint to the Office for Civil Rights that the parent filed appropriate or not? And please write into the chat. And I'm going to stop share that. Oh, there, the chat came up for me. Yay. Okay, so let's see what the consensus seems to be. Absolutely, yes, great. Yeah, the teacher's in violation for sure. Great. Okay, so that is correct. Yes, OCR would find sufficient evidence that the district violated Section 504 and Title VI by that's discrimination by delaying an evaluation of a student who's believed to have a disability simply because of their EL status. So that has always been the case, but again, a few years ago, the Office for Civil Rights really needed to make this clear to the field. So I know that when I moved to the Pacific Northwest in about 1997, so many, many years ago, and I joined an evaluation team for multilingual learners, I often had school psychologists in the school system tell me this: no, we can't refer an English learner until they've been in the country about 2 years and reached intermediate English proficiency before we can refer them to special education. And even back then I was saying, well, that's illegal, but nobody believed me. But it's nice to have this in writing and really clearly stated by the Office for Civil Rights that that can't be the case. We have to respond in a timely manner. All right. So good job, everyone. Here's case 2. So a teacher refers a Latino student and an American Indian student for special education evaluations due to concerns that both students are performing below grade level in math and reading. So the evaluation team for the Latino student reviews the student's academic records, considers reports from the student's teachers and parents, administers appropriate assessment, and observes the student in 2 of the student's classes before determining that the student does not have a disability. The evaluation for the American Indian student, however, only arranges for an assessment to determine the student's IQ, and based on that assessment, determines that the student has a learning disability. The American Indian student files a complaint with OCR, alleging discrimination on the basis of race. So once again, is the complaint appropriate? Yes or no? Right into the chat. This one's a little more obvious. Yep. Right. Okay, so again, there has to be equal processes that should be in writing in somewhere in your system to ensure that there is the same standard. Great. OCR would find sufficient evidence of, again, violation of Title VI, unless there is a legitimate non-discriminatory reason that explains the different treatment of 2 similarly situated students of different races. They'd also find a violation of Section 504 if the team determined that the American Indian student had a learning disability based solely on the determination of IQ, right? I mean, this is multiple sources of data. We'll talk more about that later, but that we need, for every student, whether they're a racially diverse or multilingual student or not, but it's multiple sources of data. And Section 504 also requires that a group of knowledgeable persons consider the information, again, multiple sources of data. So in this case, we would want someone on the decision-making team that was knowledgeable about the student's particular culture. Okay. All right, so let's just take a little pause. Are there any questions or comments that I need to respond to regarding the previous question? I agree there was a violation, but shouldn't there be a concern that the teacher suspected that an ML student had a disability after only 1 month of school? Yes, if it's a learning disability, that's absolutely true. But sometimes there are other disabilities. I remember a case where there was a student who had low vision, and the school didn't refer because they were a multilingual learner and were worried about the language proficiency issue. So really held off on a referral to the appropriate agency because of their EL status. So again, there are times when there are really obvious disabilities. In this case, it was a little muddy because I think the scenario mentioned a learning disability, which we would want to take more time and look into see how students respond to instruction. Great. All right. So who are children with disabilities? So the federal government recognizes 13 disability categories, and your state may have slightly different labels. Some states recognize 14 categories, but by and large, here are the categories for which children can be identified as having this condition and qualify for services in special education. So autism, and note that this disability was only added to the federal categories in 1990. Deaf blindness or deafness, hearing impairment, an intellectual disability, which used to be called mental retardation, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairments, other health impaired, and oftentimes you'll find ADD, ADHD under this category of other health impaired, emotional disturbance, specific learning disability, speech and language impaired, traumatic brain injury, which was also added in 1990 along with autism, visual impairment, including blindness. Now, I want to go back to traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is the only category of disability where a student can be identified as having this condition after birth. All of the other categories, the student will be born with these impairments. So a traumatic brain injury may be an example. Maybe you have a student who is in a severe car accident and experiences brain injury to the point where do not come back the same and they will need special education support. So that category is a little different. Okay, so thinking back on these disability categories, test your knowledge. So a student in your classroom performs on grade level in math and is artistically talented. However, this student struggles to keep up with the rest of the class in any subject with extensive language requirements like language arts, social studies. The student has become unmotivated in these subjects while remaining highly active in other subjects, the ones that have less language demands, right? Math and art. So what would you say their disability category is? And I think with this, we will just write in the chat. Great.
SLD, speech language, SLI, SLD, LD, possible SLI. They're moving really quickly.
Yeah, it's great. I love it. I love engagement. Terrific.
Is the student an English learner?
No. But that's a great question.
Language processing, perhaps, SLD, deaf, hard of hearing.
Oh, that's a good one. Well, okay, so let's look at this. So extensive language requirements, any content area that has that, then they struggle to keep up with the rest of the class, right? But in other subjects that are more hands-on, perhaps, or more visual, they're more motivated and they are more engaged and probably more able in those areas. So it could be true that language difficulties can be a component of specific learning disability, but I think likely the most appropriate category here is going to be this specific language impairment. Okay, so SLD, SLI, could go either way. I'm not giving you a lot of information. Okay, so another one. A student returns to your class after being in a car accident that left her in a coma for several days. Prior to the accident, the student was an active participant in the classroom and performed on grade level in all subjects. Since the accident, however, the student has had trouble recalling common words and focusing on tasks.
We're getting lots of TBIs coming in.
Yep. So this is exactly an example of what I talked about earlier, where this could happen after birth, at any point in life after birth, after experiencing some kind of a trauma that leaves the students then in need of, likely in need of services. So great. Okay. And another one. A student in your classroom has been wheelchair bound since an early age. Because of complications at birth, he cannot stand or walk on his own. However, the student is one of your top students and requires no extra academic assistance, but he leaves the classroom several times a week to work with the therapist on his gross motor skills. So which disability category? And if it's helpful.
Orthopedic impairments, we're getting some other health impairment in here.
So here are the categories.
They may just need a 504, someone says.
Could be. Okay. So this student is really an example of somebody with an orthopedic impairment. And right, I don't give you much information whether they need special education services or a 504, which is not special education, but it provides entitlements and support for students who need access, like physical support in order to access school. So they don't need academic support. Great. And the last one here, a student in your classroom wears glasses to read material presented both, that's near, not here, near and far, but still has difficulty seeing printed material. His academic performance is suffering because of this. So this student would be a student that
Visual
has,
impairments, lots of those
Yeah.
coming in.
Yep, and sometimes glasses will take care of the impairment and correct enough, but there are times when students visual disability is so significant that they might need specific adaptive equipment such as readers, magnifying readers, and such. Great. All right, so you did well in terms of special education identification. And thank you for being engaged in those little cases. Okay, how are we coming? Do you think this might be a good time for like a little 5-minute bio break?
Sure, we can do that.
Yeah, I think we should give everyone a little 5 minutes. That's it. Just take a little bio break, and we'll see you back in 5.
All right. So I have 2:22. I'm going to pause.
Hello again. All right, right on time. So we'll get started again. Okay, more about special education. So for students with a disability, whether they're a multilingual learner or not, special education can truly be a lifeline because it provides for them these protections and entitlements. But we must ensure that students are appropriately identified for the right programs based on their needs, right? So not just because we don't know how to adapt instruction to meet their linguistic needs or respond to their cultural backgrounds and they fall behind. That's not the reason to refer them to special education. All students belong to all teachers, right? So special education, as I said earlier, and related services are all provided at public expense, so they're free and appropriate. Now, something that's called the Individualized Education Program, or IEP, is what guides service delivery, and we'll be talking more about all of this. So let's look kind of to summarize the referral process after we've ensured that students have had appropriate opportunity to make progress from instruction that has been aligned to their needs. So once that happens, a referral can come from a teacher. A referral can also come from a parent that simply needs to write a letter stating that they would like for their child to have a special education evaluation. Now, the team does not actually need to provide that evaluation to respond to a parent's letter. They need to really investigate to see if a referral would be appropriate. Is there data to support the need for that? And in which case, then they would move forward with a referral. And that may mean that a student has not had the opportunity to go through a tiered support process. And that might be something, if this parent is worried about progress, that you might want to work with them about attempting some supports prior to a referral. But a referral can come from a variety of sources, and we have to respond to it within given timelines. Now, As I said, the multidisciplinary team, who needs to be a diverse team that includes a specialist in second language acquisition, decides if that assessment is needed. So they consider various difference in disability factors, the need for maybe, again, some instructional support prior to the referral, if that hasn't been in place. And in cases where there is a significant disability that would not be remediated through an MTSS process, then that referral should go forward. So the MDT then seeks parental permission to assess. Now, what's important to know about this is when seeking parental permission, this is one of the times that IDEA says that the documents need to be in a language understood by the parent. So the documents for seeking permission to assess, giving consent, those documents need to be understandable by parents. So those should be in their native language. Now, then the MDT receives informed consent and they conduct the assessment. So here are some issues with assessments. All assessment data need to be interpreted by a team that's knowledgeable in second language issues, and native language assessment should be considered. Now, I'll just tell you right now that they are not the panacea that we sometimes are led to believe, and we'll talk more about their appropriate use and some of the, the challenges associated with native language assessments that teams must consider as well as we move forward here. Okay. So under IDEA, as is stated in the previous slides, parents have rights and entitlements as much as their children do. So the federal regulations include a section that you all may have seen before called procedural safeguards. Each state will have these available likely on their website, and they're often in the some of the more relevant native languages in your state. They're often translated as well. Now, what I want to tell you about procedural safeguards is they're often in packets that are multiple pages long. And what the literature has shown, studies have shown that in English, they're written at a college level. So maybe a parent who's highly educated or has a legal background can really understand what is included in them. But once we then translate those into another language, again, at college level, they translate with translation, they are really at a level that's incomprehensible to most of our families. So it is important to know, your team to know what the main entitlements or the main themes called out in these safeguards are, so that we can make those clear to parents. Okay, so, but it is important that they still legally have to receive a copy of those safeguards, and they have the right to inspect and review educational records of their child at all times. So this is what's included in the safeguards. They have the right to participate in meetings related to identification, evaluation, and placement of their child, and provision of that free, appropriate public education. So we have to be including parents in meetings. I mean, there's been case law that I think in Hawaii, one of the cases that the school reached out to the parents couldn't make it in a couple of times, so they held a meeting without the parent, and they were found to be in violation. So really, the law is there that parents are an active participant, and we include them in meetings. So, I mean, there are many times where I've canceled meetings if the parents weren't available at the last minute. So it's that important. The parents also are entitled to pursue an independent educational evaluation of their child if they are in disagreement with the evaluation that the school has completed. And they are entitled to receive the prior written notice on matters related to identification, evaluation, or placement of their child and the provision of FAPE. So these notices have to be in a language that they understand. They have to give or deny their consent before the school may take action with respect to their child in special education, which is opposite actually of ELD services or Title III services. So if a child qualifies on the basis of your state's language screener, then the student is really automatically placed into a Title III program, and the families have opt-out entitlements. For special education, it is opt-in that the parents have to agree to. The parents have the right to disagree with decisions made by the school system on these issues and to use IDEA's mechanisms for resolving disputes. So every state will have those listed, what the process is, and these are all entitlements that parents have. So I have provided you a handout for your use, and I'll caution you of when to use these. So this handout cannot be handed to parents as a replacement for your state procedural safeguards. And in fact, this is really not meant to share with parents, but I use these to share with teams to help them understand, again, the main points that are included in the procedural safeguards. And in particular, these main points are helpful when we are working with an interpreter in IEP meetings or special education meetings. And we want the interpreter then to orally interpret these main points to the families. So families should not just be handed those safeguards again. We really need to describe to the parents what these big ideas are. So I give that to you just for your use, and hope that helps to ensure that parents are really understanding their rights. So that is included in the handouts from today. Right. And I see that you have the documents translated. Great. And those are necessary, but they're not enough. Okay. All right. So now let's have an overview of the evaluation process. The multidisciplinary team conducts an evaluation. And again, native language assessment should be considered, and we'll talk more about assessments a little later. And the question is, does the child have an IDEA disability? And just because they have a disability does not necessarily mean that they need special education. So if the child has a disability and they can be accommodated through a 504 plan, that may happen. But if the disability is impacting their access to education, then they would need special education. And then an IEP team is appointed, and the multidisciplinary team often just morphs into that IEP team. And the team has to include parents. And again, people that are knowledgeable on second language issues. All right. So often this process has led to disproportionality in special education. And we see that across the nation. So disproportionality means both under and overrepresentation. And so what we find is that kind of the more nuance of this is nationally, underrepresentation occurs at the elementary level. So we're waiting too long to refer English learners, multilingual learners that truly have disabilities. And overrepresentation seems to occur at the secondary level, and that might have to do with students that remain in English language programs long term that are qualified as both ELD and special education, that might lead to some of this overrepresentation. So now, what's wrong with overrepresentation? So that can lead to learning in segregated environments. So we don't want to put students into programs that might limit their access to instruction alongside grade level peers. And underrepresentation can mean that students' true disabilities might not be appropriately supported, or the appropriate remediation might not be provided, and they will not receive their legal entitlements. So again, we have to be really careful that we're making the right decisions into the right programs for the right reasons. So it's important to remember, though, for students with disabilities, that special education services can provide those needed supports and entitlements throughout their educational career and into higher education. So I know when I'm working with my colleagues in the bilingual or the ESL field, they often are reluctant to refer children because they don't want them having labels. But again, if the child truly has a disability, those entitlements are a lifeline. Now, there are two disability categories that tend to be overrepresented of multilingual learners in special education. And these two categories are specific learning disability and speech and language impairments. Now, these two disabilities are considered high incidence disabilities. So the vast percentage of students in the nation in special education are under the category of specific learning disability, with SLI not too far behind. And the eligibility criteria for both of these are based on data interpretation by a multidisciplinary team. So sometimes it can be difficult to distinguish language difference and disorder versus having medical criteria or a brain scan or other data that can be maybe a little more diagnostic. So this is really high incidence disabilities are called judgment categories. So if we're not looking into all the factors that of our multilingual learners, we can sometimes easily make a disability conclusion when it may just be difference. So making decisions regarding language difference for disability requires a team that's knowledgeable, particularly in that second language acquisition, and how it's going to impact learning, how it's going to impact cognitive development, how it's impacting academic development. So a team of many professionals. And as I've said to you before, I know in these webinars, I love our MTSS model that has really brought together multi-professionals to help really examine puzzles of children. And it's allowed us to make new friends for the betterment of provision of services to children. So teams need to carefully consider whether the concerns are rooted in errors due to developing their instructional language in a language that they're learning, which is often the case with English only instruction, right? Or true disability factors. And okay. Now, as I go back, okay, move this bar. So many things to move sometimes on the screen. It's hard to get things just right so I can read what's on here. All right. So here is a chance for you to think, is this potentially a language difference or maybe a language disorder? So here are 4 different scenarios. So here, student 1, in this case, language performance is similar to true peers who have comparable cultural and linguistic difference. So the language performance may be low, right? But it's similar to true peers. Is that a difference or a disorder? And I think Heather?
And Dr. Brown, I put into the chat a link that has that will take people to a poll.
Great.
I-
So I'm going to follow that link. And did it open? Here we go. And I'll share my screen for this
Oh.
link.
Do you
Is
want
that
to? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry. You share. Go.
Well, I thought I had it pulled up. Okay. There we go. Is this it?
Yes. So, but this
Okay.
would be where you would vote.
Okay. And now to see those votes.
I think probably I have to share.
Oh, perfect. Even
Um,
better.
So there we go. If you need to vote again, there's.
Great. Okay. And I would agree. I think that this is more indicative of a language disorder because we're talking about they are similar to true peers. The whole true peer group may be lower in language than we would like to see. And that means we need to do more rigorous instruction up for the whole true peer group, but they're not an outlier. Okay. Now, getting back to my PowerPoint, where did that go? And let's look at the second one. And I will share my screen. Language patterns are unique to the student, and unlike others in the student's community or language performance is significantly lower than true peers. Okay, so is this a language difference or disorder? And is there a different link, Kristen?
Here we go. Here's the poll again, and
Thank you, dear.
I can share.
Yes.
There we go.
Yep. I think it's more indicative of a language disorder because we're saying that their language is different than true peers. Great.
Okay, ready? Switch
Yep.
again.
Yep. I love this. Okay. Number 3, student demonstrates limited vocabulary even when there are rich language opportunities. So opportunity is there for rich language, but they demonstrate limited vocabulary. And I'll stop sharing.
And I'll take over. There we go. This is for number 3.
Yep. I see some for language difference, language disorder.
Maybe a little more split on this one.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, great. Let me go back.
Okay.
Let's look at that one. So they demonstrate limited vocabulary even when there are rich language opportunities. You're right that it definitely could be language difference, but I think the key was they have the opportunity to learn and they weren't really benefiting from that opportunity. If that's the case, then it's probably more likely a language disorder. Now, the last one, limited vocabulary due to the lack of opportunity to learn and use. How about that one?
And even though Roxanne says in the chat that once you've entered your information in the poll, you guys can see it on your end. I'm not sure that Dr. Brown can see it on her end. So I'm just going to share just to be safe for the last one.
Okay, so majority language difference, great.
Are we good?
Yeah, we're good.
All right,
And I'll go back.
there you go.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, I would say this one is really probably more due to language difference, and that's really an instructional issue where we can't start down the road of, oh, there's a disability when we haven't provided enough of that rich language opportunity and access for them to learn and make progress in language. Okay. Great, thanks. Now trying to move this little part of the screen. Okay. All right, so back to referrals to special education. So I want to remind everybody that a referral to special education is really not a single event, but it's a process. I've written about this in my book. And the process is all the things that we've talked about earlier, going through tier 1 and tier through, making sure that we've really provided opportunities for students, monitored their progress, made the appropriate comparisons, and really we are still searching for reasons that they're not making progress, then referral is appropriate. But here are some factors that lead to disproportionate referrals, and they include teachers' fear of misidentification. And that's what I see happening a lot nationally at the elementary level, is we're really afraid to make that referral because, well, this doesn't have enough English proficiency yet. You know, they've only been in this country 4 years. And remembering that the disability has to be evident in a native language. If it's a true disability, it's going to be evident across the first language, L1, L2, L4, every language. Another factor that leads to disproportionate referrals, lack of access to EL services. So maybe the services are not rigorous enough or aren't provided for enough time, limited understanding ML's unique instructional need, lack of non-discriminatory, reliable, valid. Yeah, that's kind of going to be an issue. And we'll talk about that. And similarities between language difference and disability. So are there any other factors that you can think of? If so, write in the chat. What are the other factors that you see that may cause disproportionate referrals? There's my chat. Yes, a myth that you have to wait for 3 years before referral. Please dispel that myth to everyone you know, Gina. Limited experience with ELs, absolutely. So we want to provide training far and wide. Thank you, Catherine.
I got a message from Joy that says staffing.
Staffing. Yeah, maybe inadequately trained staff again. So invite them to more of these presentations. A valid hearing assessment. Absolutely. Hearing and vision screen. And I should always include that at the top. Absolutely. Want to talk to parents. Yes, you want to talk to the parents, whether the student has difficulty acquiring the native language. I think I told you the story before in a previous session where we had a student that was in high school, and for years they'd been monitoring the student because he wasn't really learning as compared to his peers. And finally, we talked to parents when he was in 10th grade to find that he did not start speaking his native language of Vietnamese until he was 4. So huge factor that should have been known years before. Lack of knowledge of how a student was doing in their native language when they were attending school routinely. Absolutely. And so again, you'll see how important it is to talk to parents early on. Cultural stereotypes. Yes, great. Okay, thank you. Sometimes everyone on the team thinks it's someone else's responsibility. Yes, isn't that true? And that's why a team needs to come together and be a team, a collaborative team. Great. Thank you all. All right. Now, process for appropriate referrals. So we follow everything that should occur in tier 1. And we've kind of gone over these before, so I'm going to go through this quickly. And tier 2, we've looked at these factors before. And the factors for tier 3, we've adjusted the intensity. Maybe we provide them individual support. We progress monitor again towards benchmarks and true peers, but a referral should be made if a disability is suspected and you have that data that you've been collecting. Okay, so another Dear Colleague letter dated December 20th, 2016. So OCR's issued this guidance. It says in OCR's enforcement experience, OCR has also observed in some instances that some districts delay evaluations of EL students for special education and related services because of their EL status. This practice is impermissible under Section 504 and the IDEA and may result in under-identification of EL students as students with disabilities in violation of Title VI. So again, we can't wait because of those myths and other fears. And they went on to say if a student is suspected of having a disability and needing special education or related services, the district must evaluate subject to parental consent in an appropriate language and in a timely manner. All right, so we're going to look at a case of a student. This is a real student. And let's just look at this data and see what you think. So this is Delena. And Delena, this is her background. She was possibly exposed to drugs in utero. She had surgery as an infant for intestinal issues and medication to ease symptoms. So some little health issues. But she met typical developmental milestones. She was in her foster home when she was for a while between the years 1 and 2. She currently wears glasses. And her grandparents now have custody. She has friends, she's social, and in class she follows directions, no redirection needed, but she works best in small groups. She's now in 3rd grade in a 2-way immersion program, and here are the concerns the teacher has. Her blending skills have improved, but her accuracy is low in both languages. She often cannot access what we are doing as a whole group without teacher help. Her behavior and attention is good. Her participation is excellent, so she tries. She needs teacher to help access whole group instruction, consistently scores low on math fluency and phonics tests. She's working on encoding syllables. She's in the 3rd grade. Reading's difficult. She's beginning to blend sounds. And mostly she works in small groups throughout the day. She's not made much progress in English acquisition. Okay, so do we have data? Well, first of all, let's look at attendance. And hearing was fine, let's assume. And again, she wears glasses and she does wear those every day. She's consistent with those. So this school year, she's had 0 so far. When this referral happened, she had no absences. Last school year, she had 21 days of absences, but this year it's going better. And here's the intervention history. So she's been in this school since kindergarten. So in kindergarten, she had core instruction in a program called El Camino, which is kind of explicit systematic instruction of basic skills, those kindergarten skills. So she had an hour and a half of core daily, and she also received title support, which is considered tier 1 interventions 5 days a week. So she had an additional 30 minutes a day of intervention. And then at 1st grade, the pandemic hit. So everything changed, and it's hard to really monitor much progress then, right? But she did attend on school online, but she did not attend their interventions online. And then once they went back to school, it was half day, and they offered interventions via internet at home, which she also did not attend. But when she was in school, she got some interventions. 2nd grade, now back in school, she has Spanish core, And she has more time in a pullout in tier 2 interventions. Now we're in 3rd grade, so we've had intervention in 1st grade, although that was a pandemic, so it's hard to count. A full year of interventions in 2nd grade, continuing interventions in 3rd grade. And now she's beginning another program in October. So lots and lots of interventions. So here's data across 1st and 2nd grade and beginning of 3rd grade here for fluidez en la lectura oral, which is oral reading fluency in Spanish. So this is her Spanish data. And here you can see the benchmarks. And the black line is flow. So here she is like at a 0 in grade 1, a 0 in grade 2, moving up to 12, and end of grade 2, 26, and beginning of grade 3, 24. What's benchmark for grade 3? 85. So is she on target? Was she on target in 1st grade and 2nd grade? No. Okay. And this is current 3rd grade. She's at 24. Her accuracy and fluency, like 83. Not good. Oops. Here are syllable segmentation, Spanish. They only have a few data points, but you can see she's below the aim line. Here is the aim line for fluidez, again, oral reading fluency in Spanish. You can see she's way below. Now let's look at English oral reading fluency because she's in a TWE program. And oral reading fluency is again the black line. And you can see it was measured in 2nd grade. She was a 7, a 21, beginning of 3rd grade, 38, and the benchmark beginning in 3rd grade or for 3rd grade is 100. Is she going to meet those benchmarks? Again, you can just see a lot of red and yellow, so a lot of concerns. And here's her English language proficiency score. Those assessments were not given during the pandemic, but you can see the last 2 years, she's actually fallen more behind in reading, picked up a little bit on the listening, speaking and writing are still at a level 1, and this is 3rd grade. So, given that data, what would your team do? And you can write this in chat. So some thoughts? What do you think from the data? Not on target. Evaluate. Evaluate. Okay. Okay. So this is the case where a referral would be appropriate. Now let me ask you about the timeline. There were concerns since kindergarten. She's now in 3rd grade. Would this be a potential issue with some of the OCR Dear Letter guidance regarding timeliness of referrals? Judy screaming, yes, absolutely. Jody, sorry. Yes. Yes. So again, to point out that while we want to give appropriate times for interventions to work, years of interventions are not necessary. And we really have, yes, the pandemic fits in a year, but I think we still could have had adequate time within the 2nd grade to show that she is so far below benchmarks that she's not going to close that gap. And yes, it could have to do with the pandemic, but once you put in solid interventions and you see limited progress for, 3/4 of a school year, like we saw, I think, that's a good indication. So great questions. All right. Moving on. Okay, so let's talk, once we do get a referral, what does evaluation look like? All right, so for referral and evaluation, we obviously have to adhere to the standard process and timelines for special education. We want to document all background information. And if we haven't spoken to the family before, shame on us for one thing, but include a good parent interview and look at those developmental milestones. We have to ensure that our teams still include someone knowledgeable of second language issues in all the decision-making. Notice and consents are provided in the parent's native language or a language that they understand. Use trained interpreters for all meetings and for the entirety of meetings. I think I've said before in these webinars that I have seen meetings happen where an interpreter will come in for the first 15 minutes of an after-school meeting and then say, oh, my hours are up. And so there is no interpreter left for the remainder of the meeting, including time when parents are giving consent. So we have to make sure that there is somebody there that can interpret the entirety of the meeting and that they're trained. So just pulling in somebody that speaks some of the parent's language is not good enough, because the concepts are, very, they're challenging content to define and to interpret. And so it's also up to us as the professionals to unpack jargon and really explain concepts instead of using jargon or acronyms. So interpret assessment data relative to students' background using evidence-based frameworks. And I'll refer to the cultural language interpretive matrices developed by Don Flanagan and Sam Ortiz and their colleagues, and that's readily available. And we'll talk more about that coming up as well. Okay, so let's talk about standardized assessments in all their many forms, right? So was there a question? I heard a voice. Okay. I did see a question here in chat about interpreters. Yeah, a language line. I was going to say, I know that there are virtual services available for interpretation. Okay, so nonverbal assessments are often kind of the go-to standardized assessment, particularly for as a cognitive assessment or IQ assessment for multilingual learners. The problem with them one of the problems is they do not generally measure, or they don't measure, the full range of cognitive abilities. So you may miss strengths and weaknesses that a child has, and they particularly miss those broad abilities that are going to impact instruction. So they're only going to give you a partial picture. So they're not adequate. So let's see. Standardized assessments in English. So the normative samples do often stratify for race and ethnicity, but they don't address the issue of limited English proficiency. Okay, so our students are really not included in the norm samples. So testing individuals who have not been learning English since birth and are from a non-dominant culture on a test that does not account for these factors in their norms based on age may lose any semblance of comparability and fairness. Okay, so that's easy to understand. The norms are not appropriate on standard English assessments. So the more a subtest requires age expected development in English or cultural knowledge, the lower that performance is likely to occur. Okay, so there's many reasons why an English assessment can be problematic, but I'm going to say can be. There are ways to work around this that we'll be looking at. So the problem is there continues to be such a lack of approaches for evaluating English learners, multilingual learners, that meet the recommendations related to fairness and equity in any language. So it's really surprising that there has been a lack of research and a lack of, really publishers looking at this issue. So to accurately evaluate a multilingual learner requires that evaluators understand the manner that the performance of multilingual learners can be altered just by those cultural and linguistic variables, and how using the standard procedures can render the scores invalid. So if we report standard scores as provided for multilingual learners on an English assessment, those are invalid because they don't account for the differences of cultural factors and linguistic factors of the students. So there is only one promising framework currently available, and it is called the Cultural Language Interpretive Matrices by, as I said, Don Flanagan, Sam Ortiz, and colleagues. And here's what it is. So the conceptual framework of this CLIM is based on aggregated subtest mean score data from across relevant studies on the test performance of ELs so as to create a de facto true peer comparison group in essence. Okay, what does this mean? So it means that these researchers have looked at all of the subtests across all of the major cognitive or IQ assessments and many of the language assessments for your speech and language specialists. And they have ranked each subtest on the basis of their cultural loading and linguistic demand. And this has been done by consensus. So I remember I was part of the very first consensus group that examined subtests. We ranked them according to how much language students needed to have to be successful on the item, and also cultural knowledge, because we know that standardized tests created in the United States are built on a cultural norm, right? The American cultural norm. So based on that, Flanagan and Ortiz rank every subtest as high, medium, or low on cultural demand and linguistic loading, and put them basically in a 9-grid cell. And you take the standard score that you get from the English assessment and place it into this grid, and there is it's online, so there's a software to this. You place those subject tests into the appropriate spot in the grid, and then the software prints out a graph basically that shows you, based on the cultural loading and linguistic demands of all the subtests and the student scores, whether that student's performance is comparable to other English learners, or whether there's some of the scores are outliers. And based on those outliers, then you want to do more analysis of the weaknesses that are being shown on the graph to, in fact, ascertain that those are true weaknesses. So it helps you then determine, based on the student's English language status, their background, when scores seem to be outside the norm for other English learners. Now, this has been out in the field of school psychology for, gosh, almost 20 years now. So there's a lot of research base behind it, and it is the only framework in which we can interpret test scores for English assessments in a manner that's going to be equitable. So is it a perfect tool? No. Again, it only tells you when performance seems to be outside the norm and you want to have more data that supports that those weaknesses indicated are actually true weaknesses. But again, this is something to work with, and I highly recommend your teams to look into this. Okay, now, as you've seen on my slides, and that you'll see recommended for the evaluation of multilingual learners, is assessing the native language. Well, the only native language in which we have assessments currently are in Spanish. And there's very little research on Spanish language assessments. And I'm going to stop because I see the chat. I'll come back to the Spanish assessments in a moment. What do I see?
I was clarifying, Dr. Esparza Brown, that CLIM is not, there was a question about what the assessment was called. So I was just clarifying that it is not an assessment itself. It is,
No.
a tool to help you organize on cultural loading and linguistic loading, common assessments that you might give. So if you're a speech language pathologist, the SELF or the SELF 5, I believe, is on there. So it kind of helps you populate and then graphs the information based on whether it's a more common profile, like I said, based on like the cultural loadings and linguistic loadings. I don't know if that's a fair summary.
No, it's absolutely, that's great. It's a framework, really. The XBAS is, and I'll put that in the chat, XBAS, again, I think is the software program that where you can do this virtually, or in the software that will print out a graph for you. It's really cool. There are trainings. I don't know of any online trainings, but Sam, the author, is a good friend of mine. He's in New York at St. John's University. So yeah, many professional organizations offer trainings, or you can reach out to him.
Yeah, I do know you can directly download some of the information from, if you search CLIM and Sam Ortiz, you can find it directly on the website. However, I do think that a training in it would certainly be beneficial instead of just trying to read through and making sense of the information.
Yeah, it does take some learning about it. So training would be really helpful. I know it's kind of fun. Sam and I will be doing a combined training next month in Oregon. So kind of we talk about the overlap of these. So, okay, so let's go back to Spanish assessment. As I said, there really is very little research on Spanish language assessments that are standardized in the United States with US bilinguals. So unfortunately, it's an unpublished dissertation study that was done by me. That's one of the only studies that has been done. And that was, 15, 16 years ago. And so here's what I found from using a Spanish language test that shows that language, even when the assessment is in the home language, continues to differentially affect test performance, and a linear attenuation in performance relative to the increasing language demand of each subtest is evident. So what does that mean? So that means, I'll move this ahead. I studied one of very few Spanish language achievement and cognitive tests on the market. And that was the Batería 3 Urquhart Muñoz Pruebas de Habilidades Cognitivas. So what's important with every assessment, of course, is to look at the norm sample. So the norm sample of the Batería actually consists of monolingual Spanish speakers that lived some in the United States, Latin America, Spain, Caribbean, but they were carefully assessed to ensure that they were monolingual Spanish speakers. So they were not bilinguals. And our students are not monolingual anything. Our multilingual learner population are a product of two languages with varying degrees of proficiency across the two languages, right? So that's a problem, and the comparison isn't appropriate, and that's what I really found in the data. So my findings highlighted the fact that problems associated with the use of tests where the normative sample doesn't include our US populations is also going to give you skewed scores or skewed data. And did I say any more about it? So basically what I found is I looked at two groups of multilingual learners, and it was a small sample of, about 20 or 30 in each group. One group were ELs that had native language instruction in a two-way immersion program, and they were in third grade. And the second group that had English only instruction, but they were English learners. None of the students had been referred for special education. And I looked at all the data to ensure that they were average performing English learners and multilingual learners, okay, average performing. Then we gave them the IQ test in Spanish and looked at their scores across the broad abilities. And what we found is that the students that were in English only programs, when we aggregated the scores, the group could have been found eligible under an intellectual disability because their scores were 2 standard deviations low. And remember, these were all average achieving students and their native language was Spanish. But because they are bilingual and not appropriate in the norm sample, but they were average achievement, they could have been misidentified based on these scores as a student with an intellectual disability. And those that got Spanish instruction or dual language instruction, they were still about a standard deviation low on some of the subtests. So the data is not going to give you an accurate profile. It's likely going to, very likely, going to underestimate a student's true abilities. Okay, so caution there, okay? So although it is problematic sometimes to use standardized assessments, they can give you information to gauge the students' language abilities and how they have learned if they're in 2 language programs, you know, how they've benefited from instruction. So I would look at those to use qualitative data, also maybe that test the limits or dynamic assessment where you go back and really probe to see if giving some scaffolds will help the student. But it is important to gather some information on both the student's native language proficiency and development, and if they've had instruction in the native language, what they've learned from that. Okay. And that could open up a whole big can of worms, I'm sure. So if you have huge burning questions, ask, but that's just a little snippet, and evaluation by itself would really entail a full day. So, okay. I do want to point out in IDEA, there is something that we call the exclusionary clause. And that says that a child must not be determined to be a child with a disability under this part if the determinant factor is lack of appropriate instruction in reading, including the essential components of reading, or lack of appropriate instruction in math, or limited English proficiency. So those are all going to be factors found in our students, right? But here's the key, the determinant factor. So of course they have limited English proficiency, but we need to make sure that they've had appropriate instruction and to identify that they are not benefiting from that appropriate instruction as much as their true peer group, and they're not making progress toward grade level benchmarks with multiple sources of data and standardized assessment data. When we interpret it in a viable manner, then that will all can lead to a disability conclusion. Okay, so kind of overall about assessment, there's no magic tool on the market. The largest source of bias is really in the interpretation of test scores. And I've provided you a framework that you can look into to help interpret English test scores, and some evidence, although very limited evidence, that there is to also show that it's really important to look at those norm samples to see how much our students are included in those norm samples or not, and then to understand how scores can estimate a child's true abilities. So, all right. So I think I will take a pause for a second. Are there any questions or comments that we need to again, let me just take
We do have some questions, but they were from earlier, so I don't know if you kind of want to wait to the end to kind of go over questions that might have been more relevant from the first portion of the presentation.
Yeah, okay, let's see what our time's like. I'm trying to gauge where I'm at in the time that we have. Let's see, do we have how much more time?
We have 35. We have till 4. Well, so 35.
Okay.
More over 50 minutes.
Okay.
45 minutes, 50 minutes.
All right, so let's hold off then let's get a little further. Okay, so students at the intersection. Here are the students, and they are at the intersection of needs from both of their to support all of their characteristics need to be put in place. All right, so eligibility decisions. So once the team, including parents and an ELD specialist, examines the multiple sources of data to determine eligibility, and if they find that the student does qualify, then they'll create an appropriate IEP, or individualized education program or plan for the student. So, no typos here, sorry. IDEA requires that the IEP team consider the language needs of a child with limited English proficiency as those needs relate to the child's IEP, so students receive services that meet both their language and special education needs. And I will say this rarely happens, but it is an entitlement through IDEA. So we really need to deal with it. So here it's a little bit fuzzy, I see, but just a graphic that we have from one of the chapters that we've written on eligibility decisions. And again, you'll see that the team, you're looking at all of their assets and their proficiency across all of their languages. And we will look at their present levels of educational performance, and we'll look at those in a moment. But as a reminder here, those present levels have to include, for multilingual learners, their English proficiency, and if you have information on their native language proficiency. So that needs to be included in those present levels. Here's the expanded multidisciplinary team with the English language development specialist for multilingual learners. And I'll remind you here, but we'll talk about it in a bit, that assessment accommodations that are often indicated on the IEP need to consider state English language proficiency tests. So while the IEP will ask for the accommodations on whatever your SBAC or your state reading and math achievement tests, they also need to indicate accommodations for those state level English language proficiency tests. So the IEP goals should consider the language support needs. All right, so that's overall. So let's look at IEPs. So IEPs include a student's present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, known by this acronym, FLAF. It's a hard one to say. And as I stated just a minute ago, they should include a student's English language proficiency. And if you have any knowledge of their native language proficiency, that can be included. The IEP will also include how the disability impacts performance on general education curriculum. It will have annual measurable goals and objectives, and an explanation of the extent to which the students will participate with non-disabled peers. And our philosophy in my College of Education is that students, we really want all students to be fully included as much as possible. So full inclusion is the goal. And IDEA mandates, here's from the law, in the case of a child with limited English proficiency, consider the language needs of the child as those relate to the child's IEP. But what does that mean? So we'll unpack that here. So IEPs for multilingual learners often only address supports related to the disability without connecting the language supports that they need to be successful. So when I look at IEPs for our students, they're often look exactly the same as an English only speaking student, and that shouldn't be the case because they have different needs. So this fact leaves a gap in services and disregards their legal entitlements, as well as opportunities for native language development. So remember, they have legal entitlements for access to native language supports. They have legal entitlements for support for reaching English language proficiency state standards, and they have legal entitlements for instruction that supports their disability needs. So they have legal entitlements and they intersect, right, from different fields. And that's why their IEPs need to look different. So culturally and linguistically appropriate goals, objective programs, and services ensure a child's language development is addressed throughout their instruction. And in some states, including California, where Jerese Butterfield writes from, actually include in state law that there have to be CLD goals. So while there's actually no federal directive to include specific language development goals, even though the law, remember, says appropriate to ensure a child's language development, they actually don't say ELD goals, but they are imperative to appropriately supporting a multilingual learner in their academic goals. So another option is to embed, so you can have separate ELD goals or embed linguistic supports within academic goals. But documentation of the delivery model for the ELD services should also be somewhere on that IEP or maybe under present level so that we know, is it a push-in model? Do they get 30 minutes of pull-out a day? So what's the situation regarding the type of ELD services that they get? All right. From a chapter that I recently wrote in a book called Bilingual Special Education for the 21st Century, that was just out last year, you also have a handout of a checklist of the legal requirements on the IEP, but also recommendations for multilingual learners. So what are the kind of the considerations for our students? So that is for your reference. So here's an example of a completed chart that we include in the chapter in our book for developing this plat for a multilingual student. And you can see we have the areas of academics, reading, writing, math, but also language development, so that we clearly see where students at in their acquisition of English. Okay. So I think the next one was, there we go. Now in writing goals and objectives, we recommend the SMART format that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And those objectives and goals should be specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. So the goals need to address the needs are identified on the plat. And it states under the conditions, what conditions the student will work towards mastering those goals, as well as how progression toward the goals will be monitored and when you'll report that progress to parents as well. And progress towards IEP goals are legally mandated to be reported at regular report card time. And then when writing goals for students who are multilingual learners, the goals should address their difficulties pursuant to language acquisition. So they have to be, you have to identify how their language development is going to be coupled with their academic development. So here is an example of a speech and language goal that's related to an ELD goal. So this is kind of the embedded approach. So the annual goal here was with the model, Mariela will increase expressive language in English by speaking 5 to 8 word sentences to answer WH questions correctly in 4 out of 5 trials as measured by the speech and language professional by whatever date. And here's some objectives with the model. Mariela will answer the questions, so 5 to 6 word correct, blah, blah, blah. So you can see these, and then how we relate it to the Common Core standards, but also how it relates here to progress towards the goal of the language supports that she would need to meet academic or other goals here. So we've targeted where she's at in her English speaking and how we're going to support providing models and increase her overall clarity and awareness. So these are all really can be ELD goals and speech and language goals. I spoke a little earlier about accommodations, but this is an often overlooked area on IEPs for multilingual learners as well. We'll document the accommodations needed for state testing. They're very seldom documented on IEPs and can really cause some problems. So here's an example of our state, Oregon, and here is a screenshot of a portion of our state IEP. And you'll see under the accommodation section, the language proficiency test is listed. Therefore, once it's listed, then the teams will remember and acknowledge that that needs to be taken into account. But in most states, this doesn't occur. And I highly suggest that you do include that because students can be exempt from assessment in some of these domains, listening, reading, writing, and speaking based on your state. In Oregon, they can be exempt for up to 3 domains if they cannot be assessed on that based on their disability. All right, so any burning questions here? I do see a question. How do you provide native language development opportunities when English is only spoken in school? We're going to be looking at some models here coming up, some different ideas of how instruction can occur. So bear with me and we'll be getting to that. Okay. So the instruction that is identified through the IEP is what's called specially designed instruction. And how does that differ from multilingual learners? So specially designed instruction is adapting as appropriate to the needs of an eligible child under this part in content, methodology, or delivery of instruction. And it's to address their unique needs or ensure that they have access to general ed curriculum. So it's a product of identified goals and objectives of intervention, and it's individualized based on the student's strengths, needs, and abilities, including their cultural backgrounds, their experiential backgrounds, and their language, right? And as we said, it has to consider the language needs and connect it somehow. And while the majority of special education services in this country are delivered in English, they have the right to SDI in a different instructional language, particularly if they're enrolled in a 2-way program. But I hear you when you say, well, how's that going to happen when the staff are all English speaking? And the majority of staff in special education nationally are monocultural, monolingual speakers, right? But that doesn't mean that we can't enlist the help of bilingual paraprofessionals to help us with some of bridging of this instruction. I did develop a bilingual special education classroom back in about 1995 before I left California. And to date, it was still one of the only classrooms, one of the rare ones nationally that was where instruction was in Spanish, and the kids made a lot of progress. It was amazing. Okay, so here is culturally and linguistically aligned, specially designed instruction. So we consider their students' language and cultural assets and their proficiency across their languages. And we talked about the present levels that they include those factors as well. And the IEP goals will indicate the language of instruction and support needs. Specially designed instruction can be enhanced, just like core tiers 1, 2, and 3, using the PLUS framework as a way of making those connections across background, culture, and language to receive culturally and linguistically responsive, specially designed instruction. So there are ways. So let's look at some program models. Regardless of special service delivery model, there's a couple of important considerations. So multilingual learners who have not reached the reclassification criteria to exit from ELD programs remain eligible in special education, and they are entitled to services from both programs. So they can have an embedded model of ELD support, and the ELD specialist can support the learning specialist or the special education teachers in making those linguistic modifications for the specially designed instruction, or they can receive pull-out or push-in services, but they have to continue to receive those legally mandated services. So I do know of some systems that will ask the parents to opt out of ELD because they're getting special ed services. Please don't do that. That is really robbing students important support and entitlements that they are eligible for. So they should continue to be eligible for both services. And just because they're in special education does not trump ESL. Remember that. And decisions regarding language of instruction are based on the IEP team, which includes the parent. So they do have some voice in this. And the determination should, again, be guided by strengths and weaknesses that are identified on the PLAF. So while we advocate in my college for an inclusive model, and that's kind of a national frame of reference, we're really looking at inclusive models. We do present here a continuum of program models because that is what's listed in IDEA as options. And so we'll look at those and talk about how we can support languages through the varying models here. But to begin with, here are some questions that your team might consider to determine the language of specially designed instruction. So what's the student's home language? What's their proficiency level in English? What's their most proficient language? What instructional resources are available at home? English language instructional resources at your school. And does the IEP specify language of instruction? You should consider it. Or is there a district policy around this? Okay, so in native language and bilingual specially designed instruction in an inclusive, immersive setting. So this can occur in a two-way immersion program where there's one general education teacher that's certified in both languages, or there's sometimes two teachers, one for each language. And maybe one of those teachers has a special education certification so that they can provide SDI in that inclusive setting. So my son-in-law actually is the special educator, certified instructor in social studies classrooms. So he can serve as both. And then you could also have somebody that provides the ESL ELD services. They can be co-taught, or they can be also a pullout. But here's the strength of having various certifications and teachers with more than one languages as part of a team. Okay, that's a really strong setting, very rarely available. So in a resource room or a learning center, you can have a certified special ed teacher who's also fluent in a child's native language. That happens rarely, but this is for students who receive specially designed instruction for less than 50% of their day, that they can be pulled out in a resource room. And ESL, ELD instruction can be provided again in a pull-out or a push-in model. Regardless of the model, these ELD specialists should be collaborating with special ed teachers to help modify those assignments. Native language bilingual instruction in a self-contained classroom. So if you have a bilingual special educator, we're trying to prepare some of those at Portland State University. They're few and far between. And ELD still has to occur, and it can occur in a variety of ways, push in, pull out. But again, this is a rare model where you actually have a bilingual special educator. If you go to Texas, there's quite a few of them, one of the few states. Native language instruction in a related service, if you have a bilingual specialist. And these models can also be supplemented, or that native language support can be using a bilingual paraprofessional under the direction of that certified specialist or related service provider. So oftentimes you will find that your best language supports really come from the community. So when you're hiring instructional assistants, you want to look at your various language communities and start building staff that matches the language of students in your schools. Now, in English only inclusive co-taught settings, you'll have English only teachers. And again, you'll want to be looking at what kind of paraprofessional perhaps support that you can use to help bridge concepts, but the instruction might be in English only. But even again, in English only opportunities, you can have native speakers that can help bridge gaps for students, or help them understand cognates, or words and concepts that transfer to both languages. And always with ESL instruction. English only instruction in a resource room. So basically, these models are all reminding us that the language needs to be bridged. And sometimes the best way is going to be with a certificated teacher using an instructional assistant to do that language support. And you can read through these at your leisure in the handout, as we are, I know, running out of time. English only is specially designed instruction in a self-contained classroom. Always looking to see who do you have on staff or who you can hire to help bridge these language gaps. So that's how you do it when you have English only staff. You really look to see what does your paraprofessional staff look like. And oftentimes looking to community hires is going to help you address the language needs of your students. Okay, and those requisite ESL, ELD services can be provided with any of these settings, and the specialist should be collaborating with in all of those settings. A part of the team. Okay. So our concluding thoughts here are: healthy and effective educational systems identify which multilingual students need support early on, provide culturally and linguistically aligned core instruction and interventions matched to the level of instructional need, monitor progress towards grade level and individual benchmarks, use valid and reliable assessments across tiers, and have high expectations for all learners, no matter their backgrounds. And so today we focus most specifically on special education systems. And I hope that this was helpful to you. There's a few minutes left, and perhaps it's time for some of those questions, those burning questions.
Okay, we actually have quite a bit of time yet. I don't know, Kristen, if you're on camera as well. I was just going to, unless somebody has something that's directly relevant to where you just kind of ended there. I was going to go back to some of the early, there was one question or two questions, I believe, that were put in twice. So I think there was, certainly interest in hearing that. So one of them was, can you distinguish between the foreign born and newcomer typologies?
Yeah, actually, they do overlap. But a foreign born is a little broader in that foreign born, they can come with adequate schooling, having had access to formal education, or they can also mean, a student that's had interrupted education. A foreign born, they can have varying levels of native language and English proficiency. So it's a broader category. I do see a question that I want to respond to from Tara. How do you establish native language proficiency when the child has only received instruction in English? Yeah, so that's a hard one if you don't have staff that can really help you answer that question. So sometimes the default and the best information is, again, asking the parent, what has your child's language development been in the home? And like my 10th grade Vietnamese speaking student, when we finally got around to asking the parents when he was in 10th grade about his language development, they said he didn't start speaking Vietnamese until he was 4, and that they needed to interpret for him when he speaks to friends and relatives, because only their immediate family could understand him. So that things like that are going to give you some information, and it's important information. So other questions?
I see one Roxanne just put in. I think we get this quite regularly, but what are the best screening tools for ELs?
Well, the ones that have, I don't want to say the best, but the most robust research base, because of they've been in existence a while, and are Dibbles and Edel. So Dibbles English, Edel is the Spanish version, Ames Web, and I forget the Spanish. I think it's just Ames Web in English and Spanish. More informally, there is a book that comes out of California, the Core Reading Consortium, CORE, all caps. They have a source book and an assessment book that has tools in both English and Spanish. And so that's really helpful. So those are the ones that I think really are the most robust right now. And they do have research behind them to support their validity and reliability for multilingual learners.
And I'm familiar with those. I'll put links for those into the chat. Heather, do you or David have any others that are coming up questions?
Just looking back, one of the questions was, how do we determine if previous schooling from another country was, quote, high quality?
Well, often that will actually be in the form of looking at their records. So if you have, pretty solid records from another country listing and showing grades, and just solid school records, that's going to show that it was probably an urban system, a solid system. But it's when you can't find anything, there's limited information. And then talk to parents. It's often that schools just did not have the ability to really keep records and documents. And that happens often in rural communities. There's still many rural areas with lack of access. Do most school psychologists use the CLIM tool when evaluating students for special education for an EL student? I don't know. I don't know that I'd say most, but it's been around a while. And I know the school psychologists in Oregon mostly do, Oregon and Washington, because I brought the training in years and years ago. So, and it's still the only framework out there. Educational, Catherine, about educational quality. Quality matters, and the right education that is aligned to our students. That's the key, isn't it? So I really hope that this presentation was helpful in answering some of those questions that are hard to get at, especially when we're thinking about special education and difference in disability. I'm a geek, and it's one of my favorite topics. Oh, my newer book is called, and I only have 2 chapters in the book, but it's a great book, Bilingual Special Education for the 21st Century by IGI Books, editors, Forlon and Elsa. There we go. Don't pay full price for it. There is a 40% coupon floating around someplace for that book because it's kind of expensive. So
I don't see that went into the chat. Did that go to
oh,
somebody?
I have to, yes, somebody. I don't know why I only have.
Sometimes that can get clicked and then it'll end up.
Everyone, here we go. Let's try it again. There we go.
Perfect.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And I did enter, I hope everybody sees there in the chat, you have the AIMSweb Plus, Core Multiple Measures, 2nd edition. I added a Cadence, which is Dibbles or the, how do I say this? Formerly known as Dibbles, but there are now 2 different versions. And then IDEL is above that.
Great. So, did you learn something? I hope you learned something. Is it useful? I hope it will be useful. I think it's hard to see. There's a lot of cameras off. I'm hoping to see smiling faces or thumbs up. And oh, thank you, those of you that are coming back. So nice to end this way. It's hard just presenting to a camera. I really miss the interaction of people and getting to know you and your work more. So, oh, I love this. Thank you so much for doing that. It's just a happy way to conclude those 3 sessions on this lovely Friday afternoon. And I hope to see you again. So there's still so much more to talk about this. I feel like, you know, we've only really scratched the surface. And if we get to continue more of this into next year, I'm really hoping to include more of your specific asks and needs and challenges that you may be undertaking in your systems. So thank you so much.